What if the very traits that society sees as autism's limitations are actually its true gifts? For most of my life, I saw my differences as a curse until they became the foundation of my life's transformation. So stick with me until the end of this video to find out how a dog, a fish, and an unlikely connection saved my life and changed my experience of the universe forever. Have you ever felt like you live life on a completely different frequency? Like you don't quite fit into that mold that the world seems to expect of you? Well, that's how my journey began. As someone unknowingly on the spectrum, grappling with the chaos of life, while sensing a deeper truth just beyond my reach. In this video, I'll take you through my personal story that intertwines the struggles of neurodiversity with the transformative power of spirituality. A journey that turned my greatest challenges into profound revelations that ultimately led me to a place of peace, purpose, and understanding. So stick around, because what lies ahead may just change the way you think about autism and spirituality. My spiritual journey on the spectrum began at the age of 25. Now, I had no idea I was on the spectrum, absolutely none at all. But what I did know was that my life was steadily unraveling. I'd become so dysfunctional in society that I knew without a doubt if I didn't soon do something drastic to turn my life around, I was going to either end up dead or in prison. Every relationship I had, family, friends or otherwise, was falling apart. Everyone that knew me was giving up on me one by one, writing me off as a hopeless case. I couldn't hold down a job, I couldn't stay in the one place for more than 6 months, and on top of all that, I had a raging alcohol problem that seemed to be consuming every aspect of my life. Between the excessive drinking and my 2-packet-a-day cigarette addiction, my health was in rapid decline. I'd stay up most nights alone drinking until early hours of the morning, only to have to try and drag myself through the next day at work. I relied on caffeine tablets and painkillers just to make it through to the end of my shift. But all of this self-destruction was rooted in the one thing, which was trying to survive in a world that I absolutely could not make any sense of whatsoever. It felt like everyone else had access to some sort of unwritten rule book for life that I didn't get a copy of. And there seemed to be this invisible line that everyone else instinctively knew not to cross, but no matter how hard I tried, I always managed to step over it. My interactions with people were like trying to walk a tightrope in the dark. No matter how carefully I tried to tread, I always managed to do or say something that ended up upsetting everyone. And over time, society began sending me loud and clear messages that at some fundamental level, I was quite stupid. Year by year, that message sunk deeper into my soul. I began feeling like an alien, like I didn't belong on this planet. It was like life kept moving forward, leaving me stranded in some sort of parallel existence. And my connection with the rest of society became thinner and thinner until eventually I found myself almost completely isolated. At the time, I was reading the book The Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, which is a prequel to The Silence of the Lambs. And in one of the chapters, the main character, Will Graham, an FBI profiler, is walking through a house where a family has been brutally murdered by a serial killer. Now, Graham had this peculiar method where he liked to go to the murder scenes on his own after all the other investigators had left. And by studying all the collected evidence, he was able to vividly recreate the whole murder scene in his mind. And he would enter like a meditative state where all these intuitions and insights would come to him about the killer, almost as if it was all unfolding in real time. As I read that part, I was struck by an overwhelming realization. Whatever he was doing, I could do that too. Now, I realized at the time that Will Graham was a fictional character, but I also knew that what was being described was real. I recognized it because I had experienced something similar, something just as profound. A year earlier, I'd been working in Papua New Guinea, managing an earth-moving equipment workshop in the capital city, Port Moresby. And on paydays, I had this little tradition where I'd go to the local music store to buy some music cassettes. Yes, it was that long ago. But all of these cassettes were pirated imports from Indonesia. And there was always this element of surprise with them. I might go in and buy one that was labelled Van Halen, and then I'd take it home only to find out that it was Black Sabbath or some other band entirely. The music store was part of a complex of shops that surrounded this large car park. And during weekdays, wherever there wasn't a car parked, it was packed shoulder to shoulder with people. As a white person in PNG, I stood out, sometimes being the only white person in a crowd of thousands. And it wasn't just about appearance. There was this assumption that being white, I must therefore have a job, and that meant it was highly likely that I had money on me. Being in a crowd with money in your pocket made you an obvious target. And even though there were a lot of great people in PNG, there was also no denying that there was a very large criminal element. Every store you went to had at least one guard at the doorway, and a lot of times they had a guard dog with them. And the music store I used to go into, they had a padlock chain woven through all the handles of the portable stereos. The crime was that bad. One particular day stands out vividly. I just purchased a half a dozen cassettes, and I was pushing my way through the crowd to try and get back to my car. And all of a sudden this feeling just exploded inside of me. It was this undeniable sense that some threat was coming directly at me. Now this didn't come through my five senses. This was a whole different level of awareness altogether. So I had no idea where the threat was coming from. All I knew was that it was closing in on me, bearing down on me like a shadow. My body ended up reacting before my mind even understood what was happening. And in the last moment, the direction of the threat became clear to me, and I quickly spun to my right, locking eyes with this man who had his hand outstretched, ready to pick my pocket. Well, the expression on his face was absolutely priceless, because in that moment, he realised that I had known he was coming, known in a way that defied explanation. When I later read that passage about Will Graham in the Red Dragon book, I immediately connected the dots. What allowed him to see into the mind of the killer was exactly the same ability that allowed me to sense the pickpocket coming at me. And it wasn't until years later that I came to fully understand what this gift truly was. It was a combination of energetic intuition, clairsentience, and claircognizance. And I'll let you look up those last two words for yourself, because they're the subject of an entirely different video that I'm soon going to be bringing out. My deep need to understand my gift and to gain control of my life led me to apply for a Bachelor of Psychology at university, and to my excitement I was accepted. I believed that this was where I would finally find all the answers that I needed, but it didn't take long for reality to set in, and I soon became disillusioned. Now don't get me wrong, I learned a lot through studying psychology, but I just couldn't seem to shake this growing sense of unease. My intuition, that had always been a guiding force in my life, was telling me loudly and clearly that the mental health establishment was going down the wrong path. If I followed their direction, I felt that I'd end up in a trap that I couldn't escape from. That path didn't align with the truth that I was searching for. At the end of my first year, synchronicity stepped into my life in a way that I'll never forget. A guy called Michael Domakio Rowland. Now, he was a prominent figure in the self-development movement at the time. Well, he came to town to teach a seminar and workshop on how the mind worked. His television commercial resonated with me so deeply that I just knew I had to attend. But being a broke uni student, I had no idea of how I was going to come up with the money. And I think it was about $2,500 or something at the time. And that's when the universe stepped in. Michael Rowland ended up reaching out to the university looking for people to work as ushers at his event. Well, as fate or luck would have it, I had my name down at the student council as looking for any available work. And just like that, I ended up attending the seminar and workshop as well as getting paid to do it. The experience was nothing short of life-changing. The seminar absolutely blew me away. I walked away with this profound realization that my life's problems weren't just random or unfixable. They were a result of the negative emotions stored within my traumatic memories and the false beliefs I'd built up around them. And these memories and beliefs weren't just shaping my perception of myself, they were shaping my whole world experience. From that moment, my focus shifted completely. I stopped dedicating myself to the university curriculum and instead spent the next 6 months immersed in the university library. I was determined to understand everything I could about this idea. First, I dug into psychological studies to see if there was any research supporting the idea that traumatic memories and their associated emotions were the root cause of many mental health issues. And sure enough, I found a wealth of studies that backed this up. During Michael's seminar, he spoke extensively about spiritual concepts that supported this theory, and that opened another door for me. I found myself diving into spiritual and religious texts from all around the world: Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, even Scientology. You name it, I checked it out. It didn't matter. Whatever I could find that might shed some light on the truth, I devoured it. What I ended up finding was absolutely astonishing to me. Once I'd stripped away all the surface level differences between the religions, they were all essentially referring to exactly the same thing. And at the heart of it all was this idea that addressing and clearing the negative emotions in our memories are an essential part of finding inner peace and truth. After all that research, my intuition again spoke to me with crystal clarity, and it told me that my time at university was at an end. The answers I sought didn't lie within academic psychology. They lay down an entirely different path. And with that realization, I knew that it was time to move forward. This set up a major dilemma for me. I had a huge problem with the whole idea of God. I couldn't even say the word without practically gagging on it. My resistance to the whole concept ran deep, rooted in painful experiences from my past. My mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia while she was pregnant with me, and over the next 12 years she had multiple schizophrenic episodes. And part of her schizophrenic cycle was that she would join the Jehovah's Witness religion, and inevitably I would be taken along for the ride. And each time she joined, she would convince herself that God was going to heal her, so she would go off her medications. And predictably this led to disaster, with things steadily spiralling out of control, until she ended up back in hospital, and they'd get her back on the medications and eventually let her out again, only for the cycle to start all over. Both entering and leaving the religion were highly traumatic events for me. Going in meant being disowned by most of our relatives because they wanted no part in the inevitable chaos that they knew was coming once my mother went off her meds. And leaving was no better for me because the religion taught that only those within the religion were going to be saved in the coming Armageddon. So upon leaving, I'd be absolutely terrified that I was about to suffer a horrible death. And as I grew older, that fear turned into anger towards the religion, and by association, the whole idea of God. When I came across the idea that my life's problems were rooted in my past traumas, it resonated with me deeply. I had no shortage of traumatic memories, and the idea that these could be the cause of my struggles gave me great hope. But my deep-seated anger towards anything God left me uncertain as to which direction to take next in my quest to understand the mystery of me. At the time, I'd left university and was working part-time delivering mail for the local post office. The postmaster's wife was heavily into spirituality, and the post office was filled with all these spiritual items for sale. Incense sticks, scented candles, dream catchers, Buddha statues, essential oils, you name it. Well, one day, while I was in there collecting my pay, a local spiritual newsletter sitting on the counter caught my eye, and on the front page was this ad from this woman offering crystal healing. Now back then, I dismissed this kind of thing as just some sort of airy-fairy shit. I came from a real redneck background. But something about the wording she used in her ad struck a deep chord within me. She spoke about the power of the universe, and somehow that bypassed my resistance to the whole concept of God. My intuition screamed at me loud and clear, this is the direction you need to go in. I ended up booking an appointment, and I walked into that first session, skeptical but open-minded, and by the time I walked out, I was in a state of absolute peace and tranquility, unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. And from that moment, I was totally hooked. I began having regular weekly sessions. The woman's name was Giselle, and she encouraged me to explore other forms of alternative healing practices. And I was absolutely terrified. I was stepping so far outside my comfort zones, but at the same time, I knew without a doubt I was on the right path. And whatever Giselle suggested, I tried. Everything from meditating with the Osho Orange people to Indian sweat lodges. You name it, I explored it all with an open mind. So I ended up becoming obsessively focused upon the one goal, which was discovering the most effective techniques for clearing all that negative emotion from my traumatic memories. And this journey, even though unconventional and oftentimes very daunting, it felt like for the first time in my life I was on the path to healing and freedom. At first I wasn't focused on finding God. All I wanted to do was expand that peace and tranquility that I felt after the crystal healing sessions into all aspects of my life. I'd managed to convince myself that God and the power of the universe were two totally separate things. But deep down I think I was just in denial. I believed that I knew all along they were the same, but by separating the two, it allowed me to keep moving forward whilst giving me enough space to avoid having to deal with those deeply traumatic memories from my early childhood until I was emotionally strong enough and ready to do so. One of the things I found quite ironic was the idea that the so-called traditional therapies had been around far longer than modern-day psychology or psychiatry, yet they were considered to be the alternatives. Within the spiritual community, the central belief was that to achieve true peace, what some might call heaven on earth, was tied to clearing traumatic memories and dissolving the illusions we carry around about ourselves and the world around us. Now, many of the wisdom shared within the spiritual community, they're not new, they're ancient, passed down through the centuries by countless spiritual traditions. As I immersed myself in this world, I began to see a fundamental difference between spirituality and religion. Spirituality was experiential and deeply personal, whereas religion often felt rigid and dogmatic. And at the same time, I began to question the mental health establishment even more. Psychology and psychiatry claim to be the ultimate authorities of mental health, yet their study of the mind is relatively young when you compare it to the centuries of wisdom preserved within spiritual practices. So after a few months of experiencing what the spiritual community had to offer, Giselle said something to me that caught me off guard. One day she looked at me and said, "Yeah, I think you're ready to meet Pat now." And my first thought was, who the fuck is Pat? Like I said, I was still pretty rednecky in those days. And anyway, she explained to me that I could meet this mysterious Pat at a group meditation that was being held at Giselle's place on the Friday night. So curious, but a bit dubiously, I agreed to go. So that Friday night, I drove to Giselle's, and as I got out of my car and started walking towards the house, this inexplicable fear started growing inside of me. Now, the house itself was beautiful, and it was lit on the inside by candlelight, and the flickering light was coming out through the windows and reflecting under the rainforest canopy. And you could smell all the smell of incense in the air, and I could hear all these happy, joyous people inside. And there was this spiritual music wafting out through the windows. With each step I took towards the house, my fear mounted, and by the time I reached the bottom of the tall steps that led up to the house, I was starting to feel terror. And as I gingerly took each step up the staircase, my body started to tremble and my knees started to shake. And I remember there was just this single thought going round and round in my head, and that was, if one single person inside here starts trying to ram God down my throat, I'm out of here. So I reached the doorway and I looked inside, my eyes darting around the room, desperately trying to find a dark corner to disappear into. But to my dismay, the candlelight seemed to reach every inch of space, leaving me nowhere to hide. And the room was filled with all these joyous, radiant people, and their joy was what was terrifying me the most. Joyousness was such a foreign experience in my life, and standing there in the doorway, I felt like a deer caught in the headlights. As I stood there frozen, the crowd began to part, And through the middle waddled this little old lady completely dressed in white. And I shit you not, all the light in the room seemed to be emanating from her. Well, one of the unconscious defense mechanisms I developed while growing up was this ability to cast an aura of malevolence around myself. It was like a survival tool. It was a way of pushing people away in social situations that I wasn't equipped to deal with. On more than one occasion, people had told me that my neutral face looked like that of a pissed-off serial killer. As this woman, Pat, walked towards me, my malevolence exploded from me with a ferocity I'd never experienced before. Metaphorically, it should have picked her up and thrown her out through the nearest window. But step by step, she countered my energy with this ever-increasing aura of pure, unconditional love. And my malevolence did not rattle her one single bit. Instead, the love radiating from her dissolved my energy step by step. So when she came up to me, I was quaking in terror, and Pat only stood chest height. She was this tiny, tiny woman. She looked up at me with all this radiance and said, "Welcome, Simon," and then reached up to give me a hug. And in that moment, the dam inside me just broke, and I burst into tears and collapsed into her arms. How this little old lady held me up, I have no idea. But without a doubt, I knew that this was the real deal. This was not religion. This was not dogma. What radiated from this woman was absolute love in its most purest, unconditional form. And that was my introduction to Pat. Within the spiritual community, Pat was considered to be a fully God-realized being, and people came from all over the world just to meditate at her feet. She became my spiritual master for the next 20 years. For the first 5 years, I meditated with her full-time in group sessions, and then for the next 15 years, I continued to see her from time to time in private sessions. My early years with Pat as my spiritual master were some of the most torturous yet transformative years of my life. She'd often say to me, "God is a jealous God and will accept nothing less than complete surrender. All illusions must go." And these words, though quite profound, set up quite a challenge to my very nature. Unknowingly being on the spectrum, I was deeply rooted in my mind. Logic and reasoning were the tools I used to understand my world, obtained through a fascination with logic puzzles and problem solving in my childhood. Yet herein lied the paradox. The very skill of logic and reasoning that brought me closer and closer to what I sought was the very thing that stood in my way of actually experiencing it. Unlike the religion I'd experienced while growing up, that tried to impose a rigid concept of God upon me, Pat never told me what I must believe about God. Instead, she guided me inward and encouraged me to find the divine within myself. And this difference was monumental. Spirituality with Pat wasn't about dogma, it was about self-discovery. During this time, I was profoundly influenced by several books that helped shape my concept of God and the nature of reality. These included Conversations with God by Neil Donald Walsh, The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot, Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, Divine Matrix by Greg Braden, Biology of Belief by Bruce Lipton, Becoming Superhuman, Joe Dispenza, Asking Is Given, Esther and Jerry Hicks, and The Celestine Prophecy by whoever wrote that, I can't remember who it was. But each of these works contributed pieces to the puzzle that I was obsessively trying to solve. Even though I still didn't realize that I was on the spectrum, its many traits still shaped my journey. My ability to obsessively focus on a single subject became my driving force, and it fueled my quest for what spirituality promised, which was basically heaven on earth. This obsession ended up becoming a lens that I viewed my whole life through. I ended up dissecting every single experience of my life, always searching for that elusive final piece of the puzzle that would bring me complete understanding. My mind was relentless, analysing every detail in pursuit of clarity and truth. As my years with Pat steadily passed, I learnt more and more effective techniques for clearing my emotional traumas. Slowly but steadily, I became more and more functional in society. The more I released the negative emotions stored in my memories, the more my life challenges seemed to just dissolve, and the more my unique gifts began to surface. I began to experience more and more moments of deep peace throughout all areas of my life. Whenever I felt the need, I could call Pat up and ask for a private session, and these sessions were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. We'd sit side by side on a couch facing each other, and Pat would begin by asking about what has been happening in my life. And she had this way of making you feel like you were the most special person in the universe. Her son once asked her why was she so welcoming to everybody that turned up at her doorstep. And she said, because that's always God walking up the driveway. So after about 30 minutes of conversation, mid-sentence, Pat would begin to slowly lift her hands in front of her and start tracing these mystical patterns in the air while whispering spiritual incantations. And her eyes would begin to expand, and as you stared into them, it was like staring into the universe itself. And for the next hour, she would stay in that state with this continuous flow of tears streaming down her cheeks, and she wouldn't blink once. The experience was otherworldly. These sessions were profound, often leading to life-changing experiences. And one of the most significant for me was the experience of oneness. Spiritual texts often speak of the idea that all things are connected, part of a greater whole. And many people can understand this conceptually, but very few get to experience it at a visceral level. As Pat used to say, many are called, but few are chosen. During one session, as I gazed into these infinite pools that were Pat's eyes, I experienced a split second of complete oneness with the universe. The sheer magnitude of the experience just shocked me to the core and instantly pulled me straight back out. But the realization of it remained imprinted on every single cell of my being. And from that point on, I began noticing this interconnectedness of all things in all aspects of my life. Even seemingly mundane incidents at work became opportunities to observe this profound connection between all things. I was working as an earth-moving equipment fitter on a coal mine when one day I crushed my thumb using a hydraulic spanner. Well, the injury put me on light duties for a couple of months, and one of the tasks they assigned to me was to enter the daily hour meter readings of each piece of machinery on site into an Excel spreadsheet. And along with the hours, I also had to enter the fuel measured in litres that each piece of machinery received for that day. The whole mine site ran entirely on separate spreadsheets with no centralised data system. After I entered the fuel sheet data supplied by the serviceman into the workshop spreadsheet, that data was then passed on to the next department where they entered the exact same data into their spreadsheet. And this process was repeated across 6 separate departments, with each one redundantly duplicating the same information. At the time, I'd never used Excel before, but I very quickly became fascinated by it. And once I discovered macros, that fascination turned to obsession. The macro recorder's code used a logic that was so similar to the way I thought that I felt like I was finally communicating with something that understood my language. For the first time in my life, I felt fully understood, not by another person, but by a system. During that time, I created a centralized database for all of mine spreadsheets and designed individual data entry spreadsheets for each of the computer terminals on site, creating a completely linked system of spreadsheets across the entire mine site. My original light duties assignment stretched far beyond a couple of weeks, and I ended up spending over 6 months in total immersion in coding. During that time, I just lived and breathed programming. After a day's work, I'd go back to camp and stay up for hours just coding. And on my days off, I'd dedicate every single spare moment I could to it. Eventually, it just became my entire world. After that 6 months, not only had I created a centralized system for the mine's data, but I'd also discovered a newfound passion that was deeply transformative for me. It was so much so that soon after, really freaky shit started happening in my life. One of the traits of being on the spectrum is heightened pattern recognition. And patterns and systems are how I navigate the world. They've always been my compass. Before my coding stint, these patterns existed inside my mind as completely separate entities, but I now began to see how they were all interconnected. My problem-solving skills began to skyrocket. Connections between seemingly unrelated events became clear to me, and solutions to problems that previously felt insurmountable now began to reveal themselves to me with ease. I began to see cause and effect with stunning clarity. That brief moment of oneness that I experienced during a session with Pat was no longer just an abstract idea. It began to materialize everywhere within my reality. And it was like just beneath the surface of the reality that we see lies this infinite algorithm, a vast web that connects everything. And within this algorithm, I began to experience what I now term the inversion of reality. If I had to sum up the spiritual journey in one word, that word would be maddening. Spiritual texts often seem like they're deliberately teasing, hinting at some grand truth without ever offering up the complete answer. Well, ironically, they can't give you that complete answer because what they're pointing to is something that the mind is incapable of grasping. The mind can fool itself into believing that it conceptually understands, but true understanding only comes experientially, and that experience will not happen until you give up the need to conceptually understand, when you become, in a sense, blissfully ignorant. Quantum physics tells us that at its smallest level, everything is made of exactly the same thing, which is pure energy. Everything we see, feel, or experience is simply a part of one infinite field of energy. To me, this is God, what Greg Braden calls the divine matrix. It was during this time that I had a profound realization. I'd spent so much of my life obsessively trying to understand this infinite field, trying to wrap my mind around the enormity of it. But as I delved deeper, I began to comprehend something paradoxical. Regardless of how hard I may try or how many lifetimes I may live, I was never going to be able to understand more than the slightest fraction of the infinite. Now, strangely, this realization brought me peace. By being able to let go of the need to understand everything, it came as a relief to me. The infinite wasn't something that needed to be solved as a puzzle. It was something to be experienced. And by surrendering to its mystery, I was able to find a depth of calmness unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my life. During my next session with Pat, I explained to her that I didn't think I'd be coming anymore. And she just tilted her head and quizzically asked, well, why? And I said to her, I just don't have that driving need anymore to find that elusive something. Well, she just clasped her hands together in front of her in prayer pose and bowed her head and said, congratulations, Simon, you've finally arrived. Well, I gave her my best questioning look, as per usual, not really understanding what she fully meant. And she said, there was never anything you needed to be, nothing you needed to do, and nowhere you needed to go. Everything you've been searching for was inside of you the whole time. At the time, I didn't fully understand the depth of her words. But as I left that day, she gave me one final warning. She said, your darkest days are yet ahead of you, Simon. And it wasn't long after that session that the battle for my very soul began. Even though I'd worked through so much emotional trauma during my time in the spiritual community, there was still this dark, hidden corner of my psyche that I hadn't yet been able to confront. It was locked away, sealed tight. As a child, I was surrounded by darkness. My mother's schizophrenic episodes, the dysfunctional people she attracted, as well as the many predators that were drawn to emotionally vulnerable little boys like I was. Those experiences left scars that I wasn't ready to deal with. Well, one day while I was researching into a particularly heavy subject, I ended up stumbling across something that triggered a long-buried memory, and that memory cracked the lid on the box of horrors from my early childhood. And once that lid was open, there was no stopping what was coming out. It didn't all come rushing out at once. It was slow, excruciating, and relentless. and I fought it every step of the way. I did not want to deal with this stuff. But steadily, the darkness began to consume me. I took to drugs, I returned to alcohol, and over the next 4 years, my life steadily spiraled out of control. It was like a slow-motion nosedive straight into the ground. If crashing and burning had been an Olympic event, I would have been a multi-gold medalist. By the end of those 4 years, I'd lost almost everything. My job, my house, most of my friends, my family. But the descent didn't end there. For the next 3 years, I was trapped in a pit of self-loathing, unable to forgive myself for the damage I'd caused to others around me during my unravelling. My world kept shrinking further and further until eventually I found myself living in an old abandoned car on a vacant farm owned by a former workmate. I had no interest in life. I had no will at all. I had no inclination to climb out of the hole I had found myself in. The farm was overrun by snakes, and as a precaution I ended up getting a dog from the pound, hoping that it would be a deterrent to them, and that's how Yarra came into my life. Well, he was a born hunter. Snakes, kangaroos, pigs, you name it, he was onto it. And one day I got struck down by a severe bout of gout. My right foot blew up to 3 times its normal size. I was in excruciating pain. I couldn't walk, I had no painkillers, and after a few days I ran out of food. I couldn't call anybody because I had no credit on my phone, and I couldn't drive my car because I couldn't touch my foot to the accelerator. It was so painful. I laid down on this old couch next to my broken down car home in total agony and misery. I just wanted to die. And I closed my eyes hoping that I'd never ever have to open them up ever again. But eventually I was woken up by this smelly fishy breath being panted in my face. I opened my eyes and there was Yarra standing there in front of me, wagging his tail like crazy. And Yarra was one of those dogs that when he wagged his tail, his whole body wagged. Well, I looked down at his feet and I saw something moving. So startled, I quickly grabbed my glasses, thinking that perhaps he'd brought in a snake to show off to me. But there at his feet was this flapping fish, and not just any kind of fish, but a sleepy cod, which is considered by many to be by far the best eating freshwater fish in the world. So in that moment, I thought, if this isn't a sign from the universe, then nothing is. So starving, I quickly grabbed it and cooked it up. Well, over the next few days, as I waited for my gout attack to subside, Yarra kept me fed with fish. Every day like clockwork, he'd bring in another one for me. And as soon as I could walk again, I set out to discover where he was getting these fish from. Well, about 300 metres from my camp was a seasonal creek, but we hadn't had rain for about 6 months, so I thought it had dried up long ago. But there were still a few pools left, and they were so shallow that you could see the wakes on the surface as the fish swam below. And Yarra had taught himself how to catch these fish. That moment was a revelation for me. The universe had intervened to get me off my knees, and perhaps familiar words echoed in my mind. God is a jealous God and will accept nothing less than complete surrender. All illusions must go. I knew then that the old version of me had to die and be gone completely. According to Sufi mysticism, it was my die before you die moment. So I walked away from the tattered remains of my past life and began moving towards fulfilling the purpose that I'd been raised off my knees for. So after everything I'd been through, I found myself working back on the coal mines. And one of the first things I did was take the online autism quotient test. I was 50 years old at the time. And about the age of 40, I started to suspect I may be on the spectrum, but it took me that long to finally decide to front up and do the test. Well, the results came back basically saying I had about an 88% chance of being diagnosed with autism if I so chose to be assessed. The next thing I did was join a heap of Asperger's and autism Facebook groups. And while interacting with the community, something really striking jumped out at me. I noticed that a lot of the people in these groups were still struggling with challenges that I'd managed to overcome during my life. And they believed that these challenges were unchangeable because they were due to autism. In that moment, I had a profound realization. What had made all the difference for me was my lifelong belief that my challenges weren't fixed. Because of my ignorance of being on the spectrum, I hadn't attributed my challenges as being inherent to autism, but rather as the result of the negative emotions stored within my memories. And this belief meant that by addressing those emotions, I would be able to overcome my challenges. It was in that moment that I understood my life's purpose. Looking back at my journey, I was able to see the perfection of it all. And one of Pat's greatest wisdoms echoed in my mind. When you can turn your greatest tragedies into your greatest triumphs, you've won the game of life. Now at the time I had no real clue as to what she really meant, because my whole life felt like a bloody tragedy. But now, the full comprehension of her words hit me like a lightning bolt. Even though at the time I felt lost and abandoned in the midst of my life's challenges, looking back I was able to see how every moment and every challenge guided me unerringly towards my desired destination, which was total acceptance of myself and the world around me. I also saw how the perceived challenges, as well as the exceptional abilities associated with being on the spectrum, had worked together to guide me. I now saw autism through a lens that was completely independent of the misconceptions perpetuated by the mental health establishment. I saw it exactly for what it was, and more importantly, what caused it. In the Conversations with God book series, God shares a profound truth. All that is and ever was, God, desired to truly know and fully experience itself in all its magnificence. But knowing something conceptually and actually experiencing it are two totally different things. To be able to experience its magnificence, God needed contrast, some way of being able to perceive itself as not magnificent. This is where the illusion of separateness and duality comes into play. Since everything is God, and there's nothing that is not God, the only way to create the illusion of something being not God was to have parts of itself forget their divine nature. And these parts, us as human beings amongst other forms, were sent out into the physical world to experience limitation, separation, and contrast. And it's through this journey of forgetting and remembering that these fragments of God rediscover their divinity, allowing all that is to fully experience its magnificence. This passage beautifully encapsulates the idea that life's challenges, struggles, and contrasts exist so that we as fragments of the divine can rediscover and fully experience our true nature as aspects of God. Pat used to say to me, "All roads lead to the top of the mountain. There is only one game in town." During one session I explained to her that I must be doing this whole spirituality thing wrong. And she just smiled at me and said, "Well, why do you think that, Simon?" And I said, "Well, all these other people in the meditation group, they've all got their special spiritual interests." I said, "Some are into tarot, some are into numerology, others crystal healing and all that sort of stuff." I said, "And they all wear the spiritual clothing. They've got the baubles, the bracelets, the necklaces, the works." And I said, "And here I am. I turn up in t-shirt, shorts and thongs, and I'm not into any of that other stuff." She clapped her hands together in front of her, laughing as she rocked back and forth. "Oh, Simon, you're such a treasure," she exclaimed. Then she leaned forward, eyes twinkling with mischief, and she said, "Think of it like this. The spiritual journey is like an elevator ride in a tall department store building." She said, "The lift stops on every floor, and on each floor there's a specific spiritual wonder to behold." She said, "The doors open and some people get out and they have a look around for a while before they get back in the elevator to continue their journey." She said, "Some people get out and they get lost in the floor for a lifetime." She said, "But you, Simon, you're one of those people that just wants to take the express elevator straight to the top floor." Looking back now, I wholeheartedly agree with Pat. I believe that all paths lead to the top of the mountain, and that every single person is on their own unique journey. Some will make it to the top of the mountain in this lifetime, others will take many lifetimes. But I firmly believe there is not a single person on this planet who is not connected to Source. There are those who have forgotten they are Source, and there are those who have deluded themselves into believing that they can be other than Source. But the truth is, there are only those who are Source. How can there be anything but all that is and ever was? During my time with Pat, I saw the light of divinity ignite in the eyes of only a handful of people, even though a multitude came from all over the world to see her. As Pat would often say, many are called but few are chosen. I remember one woman in particular. I watched the light go on in her eyes in the space of just a few short months. It was quite extraordinary to watch how fast it happened. And the time was different for everybody. Some people took years. Some people just don't make it in this lifetime. And I'm sure there are many people that don't make it in many lifetimes. And it seemed like there was just no rhyme or reason to it. But after a while I began to notice a pattern. And it seemed to be the people who had experienced the most suffering were the ones that made it to enlightenment the quickest. And I think it's in Christian text somewhere that the path to divinity is through suffering, or something like that. Don't quote me on it. It is this realization that makes me believe that autism, for all its challenges, is actually a spiritual superpower. But like all great powers, it is a two-edged sword. The spectrum-based traits that shape my journey, such as my attention to detail, hyper-focus, heightened pattern recognition, logical and analytical thinking, creative and visual spatial skills, heightened sensory perception, and unyielding resilience and determination, all guided me unrelentingly towards my goal. And the suffering I experienced trying to navigate through a world that wasn't built for me became the fuel that drove me unrelentingly forward. But here lies the paradox. None of the exceptional abilities, nor the sufferings I'd experienced, could allow me to experience that which I truly desired. The understanding I sought came only when I released my need for an identification with the traits and sufferings. It was only when I let them go that I was finally able to experience that which I'd searched for all along. So welcome to the great paradox of the spiritual journey. This is the inversion of reality. This is why spiritual texts and the words of masters often sound like they're teasing at some grand truth without ever explicitly revealing what it is. The truth is, it's not something that you can grasp with your mind. You cannot find it in your exceptional abilities or your life's tragedies, no matter how extraordinary or tragic they may be. It's only when you let go of them both completely, which is everything that you are not, are you finally able to experience who you truly are. One truth above all others in this video stands out. Our greatest struggles often contain the seeds of our greatest growth. Looking back, to me, autism wasn't a limitation. It was a spiritual lens through which I discovered my deepest truths and connected with the infinite. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, it's that our unique paths, no matter how unconventional or challenging, are all leading us to exactly the same destination, which is to discover who we truly are. If you want to learn more about my insights into autism, which my spiritual path ultimately led me to, then this video up here is probably what you're looking for.